Why did his hand have to touch the one thing she trusted most? The briefing room was stale with diesel fumes and Afghan dust, the kind that clung to uniforms no matter how many washes. Paper maps fluttered faintly on plywood walls as a ceiling fan spun without conviction. Operators filled the shack, SEALs, Rangers, a few green berets, each man weighed down with years of combat, sweat, and silence. They leaned against walls, boots crossed, arms folded, the posture of men waiting to be told what they already knew. At the far side of the folding table sat a woman who didn't fit the mold but had earned the right to be there. Staff Sergeant Kadia Viper Volkov, 28. Compact, wiry, eyes steady like the horizon after a storm. Before her lay the Barrett M107A1 broken down, its parts stretched across the metal surface like surgical tools awaiting a steady hand. Cleaning swabs, a torque wrench, oiled cloths. Her concentration was complete, her breath even, the kind of patience you don't fake. And then his hand reached forward. "Get your pretty little hands off that rifle, sweetheart," the voice cracked like a whip across the shack. "This is a man's weapon." The sound was casual, dismissive, but it hit harder than gunfire. Every head turned. 3 silver stars gleamed on his collar, catching the pale morning light. Vice Admiral Marcus Brennan, 4 decades in uniform, 40 years of command halls, polished speeches, and a career built on telling people where to stand and when to move. His shoulders were square, his chest broad, but his eyes carried the smugness of someone who thought the world still bent the way it did in his prime. He wasn't asking, he was taking. His fingers curled around the long barrel of the Barrett, tugging it toward him like a father reclaiming a toy from a careless child. The operators froze. You don't touch another shooter's rifle. Everyone in that room knew it. A sniper's weapon is more than steel and polymer. It's an extension of breath, memory, hours in the dirt, and the unspoken weight of every life saved or lost because of it. To lay hands on it was to trespass on trust itself. Kadia's hand tightened on the stock. Her jaw didn't move, but inside a storm began. "Don't let them see you break." Her grandfather's voice, the one that never left her, the one that whispered in wind and silence. She remembered Montana fields, dry grass waving under the big sky. She remembered Viktor Volkov, old Soviet sniper, skin worn like leather, teaching her how to see what others missed. How mirage ripples told of wind. How the earth itself bent bullets if you waited long enough. She was 12 the first time she held a rifle steady at 500 yards, prairie dogs blinking out of sight before they even heard the shot. Her grandfather had patted her shoulder, not with pride but with expectation. "Precision saves lives. Don't ever forget it." Her father had been harder. A Marine from Desert Storm who hated the thought of his daughter carrying the family trade. But he'd seen her at a unit reunion, outshooting veterans twice her size. The very next morning, he drove her to the recruiter himself. At Fort Benning sniper course, the men had doubted her, watched every step, waited for one mistake to prove their point. She didn't give them one. Every shot perfect, every calculation double-checked, every insult swallowed and turned into steady aim. She graduated with honors, set course records that whispered through barracks long after she left. And now, here she was, in a briefing shack where paper outweighed laptops, with a man who hadn't crawled through Afghan dust in decades, fingers wrapped around her rifle like it belonged to him. "Admiral, sir," Master Sergeant Williams of the Rangers broke the silence. His voice was low, careful. "Staff Sergeant Volkov holds this theater's distance record, 2227 meters, confirmed by 3 spotters." But Brennan waved him off like a man swatting a fly. "This operation requires real shooters," he said, voice dripping with contempt. "Not diversity quotas." His eyes flicked back to Kadia like she was a child at the wrong table. "I competed at Annapolis. I understand precision better than enlisted soldiers playing with toys beyond their capability." The air went heavy. Chief Petty Officer Jackson from SEAL Team 3 stepped forward, his tone sharp. She's covered our last 3 ops, Admiral. She's the reason you've got men standing here instead of memorials back home. Brennan chuckled, a hollow sound that didn't belong in combat. If she cracks under pressure, I'll show you what marksmanship looks like. The Barrett remained between them, his grip insistent, hers unmoving. Kadia didn't blink, didn't argue. She thought of the after-action report in Iraq that dismissed her sandstorm shot as lucky timing. She thought of Afghanistan, where 6 fighters fell in 8 seconds and her name got reduced to a footnote. She thought of Private First Class Martinez, 19, killed by a sniper she had been tracking for 3 days, until someone in an air-conditioned office redirected her elsewhere. Her pulse was steady, but inside she burned. This isn't about grievance, she reminded herself. It's about consequences. Overwatch isn't a footnote. It's the thin thread that keeps a raid from becoming a body count. The Admiral tugged harder, his grip strong but not knowing. He didn't understand the intimacy of cheek welds, eye relief, breath control, the thousands of invisible repetitions that bound a rifle to its shooter. For him, it was just steel. For her, it was a covenant. The room held its breath. And just when silence stretched too long, the door slammed open. Specialist Murphy stumbled in, cheeks wind-burned, dust still clinging to his gear. His voice carried urgency, the kind that stripped rank from a room. 6 high-value targets, spotted moving through the valley, Taliban leadership, meeting in 4 hours. Boots shifted, eyes sharpened. Opportunities like this didn't come twice. They had one shot to dismantle a network, but only if the overwatch was surgical. Only if security positions were cleared in sequence, quietly, invisibly, without spooking the main group. Brennan's face lit with the thrill of relevance. He straightened, tugging once more at the rifle, as if seizing command by touch alone. "I'll assign Overwatch myself," he said. His tone left no room for doubt. "One of my officers can handle it. Lieutenant Morgan here." He gestured to a young face, pale with nerves, whose experience with long-range precision probably ended at a training range back home. The shack bristled. A few Rangers glanced sideways, SEALs shifted in disapproval. Chief Jackson spoke again, firmer this time. "Sir, those shots will be through windows across crosswinds, distances up to 1,600 meters. This valley eats amateurs alive. It's not just pulling a trigger, it's listening to the wind breathe." "Marksmanship is marksmanship," Brennan snapped back. "Annapolis taught me enough to judge who's ready." That was when he made his mistake. His hand yanked the Barrett hard enough to pull Kadia forward. Her reflexes took over. Combative's training wasn't for trophies. It was for exactly this. A twist, a step, a rotation using his own momentum. Her hand found the pressure point, wrist locked, controlled force applied with precision. A sharp crack, not bone but ligament straining. The Admiral gasped, buckling to one knee. The room erupted. His security detail reached for sidearms. SEALs and Rangers moved instantly, bodies angling, hands near triggers. 3 seconds stretched like eternity. And then Kadia eased off. Calm, controlled. She helped him rise with a grip that was firm but steady. Her voice came low, unshaken. 6 targets, any distances you choose. If I miss even one, I'll take whatever punishment you order. Court-martial included, but if I hit them all, I run Overwatch. No interference. Her words lingered, heavy as lead. The Admiral cradled his wrist, pride burning brighter than pain. Around him the room was silent, waiting, judging. Pride is a stubborn thing. And in that moment, Brennan nodded. Word spread fast on a forward operating base. By the time steel targets were set on the range, 40 pairs of boots had gathered. Operators leaned on barriers, whispering, waiting to see if the woman they doubted would carve her place in steel and silence. The wind picked up in the valley, whispering across the distance. Mirage shimmered. The mountains waited. And Kadia lowered herself behind the Barrett, the world narrowing to scope, breath, and the unseen rhythm of the earth. Why did the whole base turn up to watch one woman fire 6 shots? The dirt behind the wire was packed with boots. Rangers, SEALs, mechanics, cooks, even a few medics who should have been back in the tents. Word traveled fast, too fast, and when pride and rank collided with a weapon like the Barrett, people wanted to see how it ended. The air was sharp that morning, a cold bite in the valley wind. Flags at the perimeter fence twitched. Mirage danced over the sand like smoke only she could read. The range stretched wide, barren and unforgiving. 6 steel plates stood in the distance. Brennan himself had chosen the distances: 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,400, 1,600, and the last 1,810 meters flirting with the edge of what physics allowed. That wasn't a test. That was punishment disguised as challenge. The Admiral sat with his wrist bandaged, jaw locked, eyes narrowed. He thought distance might break her, that the mountain wind would prove his point, that she would fold in front of the crowd. But Kadia didn't see the crowd, didn't hear the whispers. She lowered herself behind the Barrett, her body folding into the familiar embrace of the weapon, stock against her shoulder, cheek against the weld, eye to scope. Her heartbeat slowed. The rifle settled like an old friend. 800 meters first. A warm-up. The flags bent left, not much, maybe 6 or 7 miles an hour. She let the reticle float, let her breath ease out until the world was still. The trigger broke like glass. Clang, center mass. The first plate sang across the range, a sound so clean it cut through every whisper. She didn't look up, didn't search for faces. She just shifted, dialed her scope, chambered the next round. 1,000 meters. A trickier wind shifting back and forth like a restless tide. She let it toy with her, then caught the rhythm, squeezed. Another clang. The plate shivered under impact. The Rangers muttered low. One by one, the SEALs leaned forward. Third target, 1,200 meters. Mirage shimmered, a heat blur that twisted light itself. Most shooters hated it. Kadia read it like scripture. She adjusted, waited for the breath of the valley to settle. The plate jumped. Another dead center hit. She moved faster now, not rushed but in flow. 1,400 meters. The crosswind picked up, gusting, tugging at the bullet's path. She factored angle, elevation, drag. 2 seconds of flight, an eternity. She squeezed. The clang was delayed but undeniable. A flat, echoing sound that sent a ripple through the crowd. Brennan's face was stone. 5th target, 1,600 meters. Beyond 2 seconds of flight time now. Every bullet lived a lifetime out there, wind, gravity, even the earth itself tugging it off course. She thought of her grandfather whispering about the Coriolis effect, the way the planet's spin bends truth if you wait long enough. She adjusted, trusted the math, and fired. The crowd held its breath. The steel plate snapped hard, another hit. Now only one remained. The one Brennan had chosen to humiliate her. 1,810 meters, nearly 2 miles. The Barrett was capable, yes, but at that distance, the margin between legend and failure was the width of a hair. She leaned in. The valley spoke in currents she could feel more than see. Wind from the left, a pocket of stillness near the ridge, mirage bending like a veil. Her breath slowed. 1 second, 2, 3. The trigger eased back. The shot cracked, thunder rolling off the mountains. The round disappeared into distance, carrying her judgment with it. 3 seconds of silence. Then a ringing, hollow, perfect clang. The steel sang across the valley like a church bell. For a moment, the world forgot to breathe. Then the murmurs started. The crowd exhaled. A few SEALs muttered curses of disbelief. Rangers nodded silently, respectful. Even the mechanics clapped their gloves together. 6 shots, 6 plates, no misses. Kadia eased up from the rifle, expression calm, almost detached. She didn't smile, didn't look for approval. She simply stood, slung the Barrett, and waited. The Admiral's eyes burned. His pride had been set against physics, against patience, against everything she carried in silence, and he had lost. But what happened next no one expected. Brennan rose slowly, his injured hand still bandaged. He stepped forward into the open space, the crowd parting without a word. He stopped in front of her. Then with his left hand, he raised a salute. It wasn't required. Not in this setting, not from him. That's why it mattered. I let prejudice cloud judgment. His voice cracked, quieter now, stripped of thunder. In 30 years, I've never seen shooting like that. He paused, the words heavier than the silence. Staff Sergeant Volkov, you will provide overwatch for this mission. The crowd didn't cheer, they didn't clap, they just absorbed the moment, because they knew what it meant. Authority had bent to skill, rank had yielded to truth. Kadia didn't gloat, she didn't need to. She only nodded once, a soldier accepting a task, not a trophy. The mission would roll in less than 4 hours. High-value targets were moving through the valley. Guards would need to vanish quietly, one by one, or the whole operation would collapse. Her role was no longer in question. She would be the thread holding it together. And as the crowd dispersed, whispers followed her. Some were in awe, some were in disbelief. A few were filled with a respect they hadn't carried before. But Kadia felt none of it. She only felt the weight of the rifle in her hands, the echo of her grandfather's voice, the quiet reminder that dignity doesn't argue, dignity doesn't shout. It waits, it steadies, it fires. Why do the quiet hours before a mission feel heavier than the mission itself? The valley was still, too still. Mountains pressed in from both sides, jagged ridges silhouetted against a pale Afghan sky. Diesel fumes lingered, clinging to every breath. Somewhere downrange, 6 high-value targets moved through villages and goat trails, their paths converging like rivers. In less than 2 hours they would sit in one compound, their guards scattered across rooftops and doorways. A perfect window, but only if the overwatch thread held tight. Inside the operations tent, the air buzzed with low voices. Maps covered the plywood tables. Radios hissed with static. Operators checked and rechecked gear, adjusting straps, loading magazines, tightening optics. Everyone had a job. Everyone carried weight. Kadia sat apart, Barrett laid across her lap. Not hidden, not displayed. Just there, as natural as the rifle sling across her shoulder. She ran a cloth along the receiver, checked her dope card again, though she didn't need to. Numbers were burned into her mind, wind at 1200, drop at 1600, spin drift Coriolis. Math and memory, the language of survival. But her mind wasn't on the numbers. It was on Martinez. 19, young. His face had carried more acne than beard. He joked about buying a Camaro when he got home. He hadn't made it that far. A sniper had taken him through the chest, clean and final. Kadia had tracked the shooter for 3 days, adjusting, waiting, ready, until a desk officer miles away redirected her to a priority deemed higher. By the time she came back, Martinez was a name carved into a memorial. She had carried that silence ever since. Her fingers tightened around the rifle. This mission couldn't afford silence. Not that kind. Not again. Across the tent, Brennan stood with his officers. His wrist was still bandaged, his pride even tighter. He spoke in clipped tones, issuing directives like they were bullets. But every so often his eyes flicked toward Kadia, not with scorn anymore, not even with doubt, with something harder to place. Respect fighting against old instincts. Chief Jackson passed by her table, pausing just long enough to murmur, "Don't let him in your head, Viper. Tonight's yours." She gave a single nod. Words wasted energy. The valley would require all of hers. At 1800, the convoy rolled. Engines low, headlights off, dust rising in pale trails behind armored wheels. The sun dipped, washing the ridges in orange and shadow. Soldiers shifted in the back, weapons cradled, eyes closed or staring ahead. Some prayed. Some hummed under their breath. Everyone had their ritual. Kadia's was silence. She leaned against the steel wall of the MRAP, eyes on nothing, breath steady. She thought of her grandfather again, of him teaching her to listen, not just to wind or mirage, but to silence itself. Patience is faster than bravado, he had told her. The bullet is already there before the man who fires in haste knows he missed. She carried that into every deployment. It wasn't bravado that saved lives, it was silence. The convoy halted near a ridge line. Engines died. Darkness pressed in, broken only by starlight. No lamps, no chatter, just boots crunching as operators moved into position. Kadia slung the Barrett, the weight solid and familiar. She climbed the ridge without a word, boots slipping on loose rock, her breath controlled, muscles burning steady. Each step was deliberate. At the crest, she settled into the overwatch nest they'd scouted earlier. A depression in the rocks, wide enough for her, the rifle, and a spotter if she needed one. But she didn't. The Barrett stretched out before her, scope angled toward the valley compound below. Through the glass, the world narrowed into clarity. Shadows of guards moved across rooftops. Lantern light flickered in courtyards. The compound breathed with life and danger. Her earpiece crackled. "Viper, this is actual, call your targets." She whispered into the mic, voice low, steady. Overwatch set. 6 guards visible, 3 on rooftops, 2 at doorways, 1 on patrol, marking positions. Copy. Copy, stand by. We move on your call. Her finger brushed the trigger guard, not touching, just feeling its edge. Every nerve in her body aligned with the rifle. The mission hadn't even started, and yet she felt it, that fragile thread pulling tight. Lives dangling from it. Any slip, any miss, and the valley would flood with gunfire. She exhaled slow. In the distance, one of the guards stretched, rifle slung lazy, unaware that a woman on a ridge had already measured the angle of his breath, the distance between his heartbeats, the exact second he would cease to exist. And still her thoughts flickered. She thought of being the only woman in barracks where silence carried as much judgment as words. She thought of the nights staring at a cot ceiling, wondering if she was there because she was good or because someone needed to fill a line on a report. She thought of how many times she had proven herself only to have the record erased by the arrogance of men who never carried her rifle. This mission wasn't just about 6 guards. It wasn't about Brennan or even about respect. It was about silence given weight, about not letting Martinez's death repeat itself. Her earpiece crackled again. "Viper, confirm ready." Her breath steadied. She pressed the mic once. "Ready." The valley fell into stillness. Operators crept through shadow, their lives tied to her scope. Brennan watched from below, forced into the role of observer, and Kadia Volkov became what she had always been trained to be, the line between chaos and survival. The crosshairs hovered, the wind shifted, she waited. And the first shot of the mission drew closer, a moment heavy enough to bend time itself. Why does the first bullet always feel like the loudest lie you ever tell yourself? Dark folded over the valley like a blanket, but the compound below was alive with small fires, lamplight stoves, the careless glow of men who thought the night belonged to them. From her nest on the ridge, Kadia could see the angles where shadows pooled, where a single light could show a face or erase a silhouette. The scope painted the world in soft green lines. Every guard had a number now. Every door a geometry. Every shutter a variable. Her breath matched the rhythm she had trained into the marrow. 1, 2, 3. The breath that holds a shot is not heroic. It is patient, weary, practiced. The Barrett sat solid against her shoulder, a heavy friend that did not demand words. Out in the valley, things moved in slow, dangerous increments. Inside her, time condensed into the small universe of the reticle. Actual, this is Viper. Confirm target 1, rooftop, northeast corner. Range 810 meters. Wind set left to right at 10. Call when ready. Her voice into the mic was a whisper, but that whisper carried the fate of a dozen men who might live or die by the seconds that followed. Copy, move on my mark. 2 teams half a click to your left, watch for muzzle flashes. We take guards quietly in sequence. You take the first, then the second when the signal goes. Keep it clean." The reply came clipped, professional. Somewhere far below, the task force held its breath with her. She watched the guard on the rooftop. He smoked with a slouch that betrayed complacency, a cigarette hand in the night. There was a softness to him, maybe 30 at most. He hummed some tune she couldn't place. Her finger found the trigger, resting like a promise. She didn't think about killing. She thought about stopping someone who would have killed without hesitation. She thought about Martinez and small, heartbreaking things. Camaro dreams evaporated in an instant. The shot rode out. The world snapped open and closed with it. The guard slumped forward as if sleep finally won. No one below flinched. That was the point. A body that fell quiet and a mission that kept breathing. The radio clicked with confirmation. Target neutralized. Move 2 in sequence. She had imagined this part hundreds of times. In practice, rehearsals could capture the smell of the night or the way wind made small prismatic lies in lamplight. Reality carried its own rules. The second shot required a new correction, gusts from a ridge she hadn't accounted for, a whisper of wind that would have nudged a flight path and turned a perfect shot into a tragedy. She adjusted quickly, instincts braided with raw math. The round went and found its mark. 2 down. 2 more teams shifted into action like ghost dancers, removing bodies that would be noticed only as absent breath hours later. Between shots, her world shrank. There was a tape in her mind with Martinez's laugh playing under the static. She felt the old, familiar ache, loneliness dressed as focus. Being the only woman in rooms made of muscle and static had a cost. People assumed she would be softer, more tentative. They assumed emotion compromised steadiness. They were wrong. Her feelings, anger, grief, a quiet hunger for justice, sorted themselves into discipline, then into a perfect hold on the trigger. The third guard was in a doorway. The angle was awkward. The bullet had to thread through a frame that might deflect a stray edge. For a breath, the world was math and thin glass. She breathed in, squeezed. The plate of the world sang like metal. The man collapsed inside the threshold without a noise larger than the whisper of his falling lantern. The task force moved like water then, quiet, relentless, filling the shape of the plan. At 4, the compound stirred. A dog barked sharp, brief, the kind of sound soldiers curse in their sleep. Footsteps shuffled. One of the guards turned his head and she watched the moment slide by like a stone on water. Her training taught her to treat hesitation as a resource. She used the seconds, not wasted it. The shot took him as he turned, sending him down with the same finality as the others. The dog went quiet. The compound continued to breathe, none the wiser. Her ear hummed with radio static. Below, teams signaled with small hand motions and soft clicks. Good, move, check. Each whisper was a confirmation that her shots meant something larger than a plate on a range. They unthreaded a plan of violence before it could become a reality for dozens of soldiers or civilians. That knowledge tightened her chest with something like relief and a soundless gratitude she could not voice. But precision doesn't erase cost. Each time a man fell, she imagined the ripple. Mothers who'd wait on porches at dawn, fathers cleaning rifles, children who might one day ask questions. She mentioned these not to make herself soft, but to hold the human shape of the moment as she pressed steel into the night. A sniper's work distills morality into a pinpoint. That pinprick can save lives. It can also fracture souls. She knew that. She had carried the fracture in the past, and now she braced for the fracture's echo. They were moving toward the last 2 identifiers, guards in a small courtyard and a patrol on a track that circled the compound like a slow clock. Her scope picked them out. A flicker of movement, a shadowed gate, a cigarette ember in the dark. The distance for the final shot pushed the envelope. She had made longer ones before, but never with people cascading through a mission plan, never with the responsibility of dozens of lives stacked behind the click of the trigger. Somewhere deep inside, behind the discipline and the math, a low voice whispered, "Don't be the reason the mission fails." She swallowed the thought and let her training take over. No heroics, no risk beyond what was necessary. The courtyard guard shifted, too slow, too predictable. Kadia inhaled and let the tension build, counting the seconds like a metronome. She found her hold, let the wind tell her what to do, and fired. The bullet took him through the ribs. He folded against a wall, palms splayed, a surprised curse cutting off as blood found the stone. One more. The patrol circled in a slow, mechanical rhythm. They would have wondered what had happened to their buddies. Maybe they'd think of tribal disputes, or quick vengeance, or bad luck. The task force moved, exploiting the confusion with a precision honed by practice and necessity. The last shot was long. Her breath steadied to the tempo of a whispered prayer. She adjusted for Coriolis, an old man's trick her grandfather had taught her by the light of a coal stove, and trusted the math. The muzzle flashed. The night answered with a dull, distant sound, and the patrol man stumbled forward, surprised. He collapsed in the dust as the world kept turning. Silence filtered back over the compound like dust settling. No alarms, no frantic shouts. The mission had remained surgical. The team closed in, moving like a shadow, and swept the compound. Within an hour, the men who had meant to meet were shackled and bewildered, led away into the hands that had planned and waited. Kadia watched the result unfold through the scope and felt something shift. Triumph is a bright, brittle thing that can cut you if you hold it too long. She didn't let it cut. She felt tired not from physical exertion but from the continuing demand to prove herself, from the calculus that turned grief into focus and then into more grief. She thought of her grandfather's hands, calloused and steady, and how he had taught her to listen to the land and to silence. Tonight the land had spoken, and she had answered. When the task force radio finished with a clean, targets secured, no civilian casualties, all teams accounted for, the relief that unfurled through her was small and private. It was the kind of relief you tuck into a pocket because the world still needed you steady. She breathed out, long and slow. Her finger left the trigger and rested on the stock. Down below, Brennan watched from a small berm, hands still wrapped, eyes not quite dry but softened. He caught her eye across the distance, and this time there was no pride left to fight. He gave her the kind of look that acknowledges an error corrected, not a wound bandaged. There was a tilt to his mouth that might have been apology. It was small, inadequate, but earnest. Later, after the convoy exhaled, and men unloaded and rechecked their gear under a sky already edged with dawn, someone would suggest medals and commendations. Later, people would write reports and pass them up the chain, and word of what had happened would bloom in briefings and quiet mess halls. Her name would move across dispatches and into a form that read like praise and also like an attempt to reconcile something older. For now, though, the valley lay quiet, and Kadia sat on the ridge with the Barrett across her knees, watching darkness thin into light. She thought of Martinez again, and of every life she had been given the chance to protect because she had learned to wait. She thought of Brennan and how the man had changed from an obstacle into something human in 30 agonizing, private minutes. She was grateful but wary. The world could be quick to celebrate and quicker to forget. On the ridge, in the gray wash of morning, she tightened the sling and felt the weight of her choices settle in a way that made her shoulders ache. Duty had been fulfilled. Justice, in the small, immediate sense, had been served. But the moral ledger in her chest stayed unresolved. There would always be a debt for the ones lost, and you could never square the books completely. And yet, as she watched the sun lift the valley's edges, a sentence her grandfather used to say floated back to her. Sometimes the right shot is the one you take for the people who never got to take it for themselves. She tasted that thought like old tobacco, bitter and honest, and for a moment she let herself be only that. A woman who had done what she could, who had steadied, who had fired. The task force moved out, but the valley had been altered. Ghosts were taken off the field and replaced by living men in cuffs. Somewhere, families would start to breathe easier. She did not pretend the world had changed. She only knew that tonight, a handful of lives had been spared because someone had waited in the dark and answered when the time came. When they finally climbed back into the convoy, Brennan walked over. He stopped a few feet away, looked long at the rifle, then at Kadia. He extended a hand, not to touch the weapon but to touch the person who had used it. "Staff Sergeant Volkov," he said, measured, rower than before. "You did what needed doing, thank you." She took his hand once, feeling the callous of an old life and the tremor of new respect. She didn't search for more. Gratitude doesn't need performance. Sometimes it is simply acknowledged, then carried forward. They drove back to base with the sun trying to crawl over the ridgeline. The valley fell behind them, its quiet restored but altered. Kadia watched the landscape and felt, for the first time in a long while, the small steadiness of having lived into the truth of what she had been trained to do. Why does silence after success feel heavier than the mission itself? The convoy rumbled back through the valley, engines low, the rhythm steady but subdued. Dust rose in pale spirals behind the armored wheels, drifting off into the fatting night. Inside, the operators didn't cheer. They didn't slap backs or trade loud jokes the way civilians imagined soldiers did. They sat with their weapons across their laps, helmets tipped forward, eyes staring into nothing. Victory in war wasn't champagne and flags. It was breath still in lungs. It was a count of names still alive when the sun rose. Kadia sat in the corner of the MRAP, Barrett resting across her knees. Her cheek pressed lightly against the sling as if to reassure herself it was still there, still tethered to her. She watched shadows flicker through the open hatch, her mind replaying every shot, every second stretched into eternity. She knew they'd been perfect. She knew she'd done her job. And yet something restless coiled inside her chest, because perfection didn't erase cost. It only postponed it. She closed her eyes and saw Martinez again. The 19-year-old grin, the Camaro he would never drive. She wondered if tonight she had spared someone else's Martinez, some kid in the valley who would go home, joke about cars, grow old. Or had she just shifted the weight around, trading one ghost for another? The convoy jolted, snapping her eyes open. Across from her, Brennan sat stiff, his bandaged wrist resting on his knee. He looked out the hatch, jaw tight, but his expression had changed since the range. The arrogance had burned off. What remained was harder to read, pride maybe, but bent, reshaped into something quieter. After a long silence, he looked at her. Not down at her, not past her, at her. "You saved men tonight," he said. His voice carried no thunder now, just gravel, more than you'll ever know. She didn't answer. Words weren't her weapon, precision was. When the convoy rolled through the wire and into the fob, dawn was bleeding across the mountains. The base stirred awake, the smell of diesel mixing with dust and instant coffee. Operators unloaded, their movements slow, almost reverent. Gear was stacked, weapons cleared, helmets unbuckled. A few men patted her shoulder as they passed, quiet acknowledgments without ceremony. Respect was never loud. Brennan lingered. He gathered his officers, spoke in hushed tones, and finally approached Kadia where she sat on a crate wiping dust from the Barrett's receiver. His injured hand hung awkwardly at his side, wrapped in gauze. He hesitated, which was its own admission. "Staff Sergeant Volkov," he began, voice formal but softer. "You proved me wrong publicly, thoroughly. I won't pretend otherwise." He paused, swallowing pride like a bitter pill. "I'll be writing the citation myself, not for the range, for what you did tonight." Kadia looked up at him. Her eyes gave nothing, but inside she felt the strange weight of hearing a man like him say that. She nodded once. "Sir." That was enough. Later in the command shack, the after-action report unfolded. Maps littered the table, radio logs ticked with timestamps, and intelligence officers connected dots that could never have been connected without her overwatch. The captured targets spilled information faster than expected. Plans for 3 coordinated attacks surfaced, attacks that would have killed dozens, maybe more. Those plans died in the valley because 6 guards never raised alarms, because her rifle spoke before theirs could. Word spread beyond the base. Quietly, then loudly. Rangers talked. SEALs carried stories back. Even the cooks who had stood on the range whispered about the woman who'd put steel into silence and forced an admiral to salute. By noon, half the base knew her name. By dusk, every operator did. Kadia hated that part. Attention wasn't why she pulled triggers. Attention didn't matter in a hide site with wind clawing at your face. It didn't matter when you were waiting 14 hours for a single shot that might save a patrol from walking into death. Attention was fleeting. Precision was permanent. Still, when Brennan stood in the briefing room that evening, bandaged wrist visible, and addressed the assembled teams, he didn't hedge. "I let arrogance override judgment yesterday," he said. His voice carried across the shack, raw but clear. "I questioned a soldier whose skills eclipse my own. I was wrong. Staff Sergeant Volkov provided overwatch for an operation that will save hundreds of lives. I'll say it once for the record, performance outranks prejudice. Always." The room was silent for a heartbeat. Then boots shifted, heads nodded. A few men tapped tables softly, the closest thing to applause in a place where applause felt foreign. Kadia sat still, expression unchanged, but deep down a knot loosened. Not all of it, never all, but some. When the Admiral walked past her afterward, he paused. He leaned closer, voice lowered to a whisper meant only for her. "I built a career thinking authority was enough," he admitted. "You reminded me it's not. I'll carry that lesson back with me." She gave him nothing but a nod, because that was all the moment required. That night, under a sky stitched with stars, Kadia sat alone by the rifle range. The Barrett lay across her knees again, its weight familiar, steadying. She thought of her grandfather. She thought of Montana wind, of his voice teaching her how silence speaks if you listen long enough. She thought of how he'd told her not to confuse respect with approval. Respect had to be earned on its own terms. The valley had given her that respect, but it hadn't erased the ache. She tilted her head back, eyes tracing constellations she couldn't name. She whispered into the dark, not to Brennan, not to her team, but to Martinez, to her grandfather, to every ghost that rode beside her. "I didn't miss," she murmured, "not tonight." And in that moment she felt something rare. Not pride, not vindication, just a small, fleeting peace. Why does recognition sometimes feel heavier than combat? The base had gone back to its rhythm. Missions rolled, patrols shifted, and the cycle of dust and diesel repeated. But for Kadia, something had changed. Not in how she carried the Barrett, that weight was constant, but in how people looked at her. Men who once dismissed her as a footnote now nodded when she passed. Operators stopped by her table in the mess hall, some silent, some offering a short word, respect, steady work, hell of a shot. Small acknowledgments, but she noticed. They didn't erase years of silence, but they marked something. She was no longer invisible. Brennan left the valley a different man. When his convoy rolled out, he carried more than his bandaged wrist. He carried the memory of 6 perfect shots and the quiet defiance of a soldier who didn't yield. No one knew what he'd tell Norfolk, but a rumor lingered. He wasn't returning unchanged. 2 weeks later, paperwork arrived. Kadia was called into the command shack, handed a folder that felt heavier than its weight. Inside was the recommendation for a Silver Star. The signature at the bottom, Vice Admiral Marcus Brennan. She stared at the paper, not because of the medal awards were just medal and ribbon, but because of who had written it. A man who once tried to strip the rifle from her hands now put his name behind her actions. She felt no triumph, only a strange, steady calm. Respect had finally been forced into print. When the deployment ended, she rotated home. Montana looked smaller when she returned, though the sky stretched just as wide. Her father hugged her tight, pride unspoken but clear in the tremor of his grip. He didn't talk about medals or records. He only asked if she was sleeping, if she was eating, if the ghosts were quiet. She told him what fathers needed to hear: "I'm fine." Her grandfather was older now, his breath shallow, his steps slowed. But his eyes, those were the same, sharp, piercing. The eyes of a man who had waited in hides, who had seen snow and blood mix into memory. She placed the Silver Star citation on his nightstand, beside his Soviet medals and an old photograph of him in a younger war. He looked at it, then at her. "You made them see," he whispered, voice like dry leaves. Kadia swallowed. I made them listen." He smiled faintly, a proud, fragile thing. "Good. The wind carries truth only if someone's willing to breathe it." 2 weeks later he passed, his last breath quiet, his hand resting on hers, as if still teaching her patience even as the world slipped away. She buried him with his medals, her citation folded beside them. The army didn't give her time to grieve. Orders came down within a month: Fort Bragg, instructor duty. The Special Operations Target Interdiction Course, SOTIC. The Advanced Sniper Program. She would be the first woman to hold the role. When she arrived, the barracks buzzed with whispers. Some instructors folded arms, skeptical. Students whispered louder, half in awe, half in doubt. She felt their eyes when she walked ranges, when she lectured about wind, angle, density. They listened, but she knew what many thought. Can she prove it here? Can she teach what she's done? The first week, she stood on the firing line with a dozen students. Young men, some cocky, some scared, all waiting to see if the legend matched the rumors. The range stretched out in steel silhouettes, distances marked in paint. She picked up the Barrett, slung it like it was just another tool. No drama, no speech. She set up at 1,800 meters, the same distance Brennan had tried to bury her with. Mirage shimmered, flags twitched. She didn't over-explain, she didn't boast. She just let the rifle speak. The plate rang crisp and undeniable. One shot, one answer, the murmurs stopped. Respect took root. In the weeks that followed, she drilled them hard. Not with arrogance, but with honesty. Don't rush the shot. Don't chase bravado. Precision saves lives. Remember that. Every time you fire, someone's child makes it home or doesn't. That's what you carry. Some students bristled. Some broke under the weight. But others leaned in, learned to listen the way her grandfather taught her. Those were the ones who made it. At night, in the quiet of the instructor's quarters, she lay awake. Her grandfather's absence pressed heavy, but so did the legacy he left. She thought of Martinez. She thought of the men in the valley. She thought of the Admiral who had once sneered and had left changed. She wondered if she could change more, not with shots fired, but with lessons taught. Because teaching wasn't easier than combat. It was harder. Out there, you had control of your own trigger. Here, you had to trust others to learn theirs. You had to hand them the thread of survival and pray they didn't drop it when it mattered most. The first time one of her students returned from deployment and found her in the halls, his face rough with exhaustion but his eyes alive, he said 3 words. "Your lesson worked." That was the moment she realized her mission hadn't ended in the valley. It had only shifted, from saving lives with her own precision to saving them through the hands of others. And yet, every time she laid the Barrett across her knees, every time she cleaned it in silence, she remembered. That rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was a covenant, between her and the wind, between her and the ghosts, between her and the truth that dignity doesn't shout. It waits, it steadies, it fires. Why is it harder to teach someone else to pull the trigger than to do it yourself? Fort Bragg hummed with a rhythm different from Afghanistan. Here, the danger wasn't immediate. No valleys, no ambushes, no sudden calls over the radio that split life from death. Instead, there was structure. Classrooms, chalkboards smeared with ballistics equations, firing ranges measured in precise increments. But the air carried its own kind of weight, the burden of preparing others to face what she had already seen. Kadia stood at the front of the sniper schoolhouse, a dozen students watching. Their uniforms were clean, their eyes sharp, some restless, some cautious. She read them like targets: the cocky corporal who believed nothing could touch him, the quiet sergeant who hid fear behind discipline, the private who looked too young to hold the kind of responsibility he'd been given. Each man was a story still unwritten. Each carried the potential to save lives or lose them. On the board behind her, she scrawled numbers, drop rates, wind drift, Coriolis, the math of survival. "You'll want to remember these," she said, voice even, measured. "Because in the field, it's not just math, it's breath, it's patience, it's deciding who lives and who doesn't, and the numbers don't forgive arrogance." Some scribbled notes, some smirked. She saw it, the skepticism, the sideways glances, a woman teaching them how to shoot. Some still thought it was a contradiction, no matter what stories they'd heard from downrange. She didn't flinch. She had seen worse than doubt. She had stood under the judgment of men with stars on their collars. She had made them salute. A dozen students with folded arms weren't going to break her. On the range, she proved it the way she always had. She laid behind the Barrett, settled in, and let the rifle speak. 1,800 meters, one shot. The plate rang out, sharp and clear. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Respect doesn't come from arguing, it comes from results. Over time, their resistance softened. Not because of her words, but because of the way she demanded discipline. She drilled them through endless repetitions. Hours under the sun, lying in dirt, sweat stinging their eyes, their hands trembling from holding rifles too long. She didn't ease up. "You think fatigue is an excuse," she barked once at a corporal who complained about the heat. "Tell that to the patrol that won't make it home because you rushed your shot." They learned quickly, not just the math but the silence. She made them lie in hides for hours without firing, forced them to feel the crawl of time, the itch of stillness. Some broke, shifting, cursing, begging to move. She let them. Better to break here than in the field. At night, when the students went back to their bunks, Kadia sat in the empty range shack, her Barrett across her knees. She cleaned it in silence, the same ritual she had carried since Montana. And every time ghosts gathered. Martinez, her grandfather, faces blurred by memory but sharpened by loss. She carried them quietly, letting their weight anchor her. One evening, a young sergeant lingered after class. He was wiry, nervous, his eyes darting like a man trying to find courage in a room where it didn't come naturally. "Ma'am," he said, hesitant, "why do you do it? After all that, why come here? Why not get out, take the medal, live easy?" She looked at him for a long moment. The question wasn't disrespect. It was curiosity, fear disguised as wonder. "Because," she said finally, "precision saves lives. And if I don't pass that on, someone out there pays the price. Maybe someone like you. Maybe someone like Martinez." He didn't ask who Martinez was. He just nodded, quiet, understanding something unspoken. But not every day was that simple. Some instructors resisted her presence. A few undermined her subtly, questioning her methods in meetings, dismissing her critiques with bureaucratic smiles. She ignored most of it, but some nights it cut deeper than she admitted. Because every time she fought for her place, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every soldier who would come after, for every woman who might one day stand on the same line. And she carried the pressure of legacy. Every student who passed through her class would carry her lessons into the field. If they failed, if they faltered, part of that failure would be hers. Teaching wasn't just about skill. It was about trust. And trust, she knew, was heavier than any rifle. One winter morning, during a live-fire exercise, a student missed 3 shots in a row at 1,200 meters. His frustration boiled over. He slammed his fist against the dirt, cursing, blaming the wind, the rifle, anything but himself. Kadia knelt beside him. Her voice was low, cutting through his rage without volume. "The wind doesn't care about your excuses. The rifle doesn't care about your pride. The man you're supposed to protect doesn't get another chance. You either learn to listen or someone dies. Which one is it?" The words sank in. He reset. He hit the next shot, and she saw it, the shift. The moment arrogance gave way to humility. Moments like that carried her. Not medals, not recognition. Just the quiet knowledge that maybe, just maybe, she had changed the trajectory of someone's life. Yet even in those moments, the ghost stayed. She still woke some nights to Martinez's face, to the sound of shots she hadn't fired, to the silence that followed missions where bodies never made it home. She carried them into the classroom, into the range, into every lesson. Not to burden her students, but to remind herself why the weight mattered. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. Students began to seek her out not just for ballistics, but for guidance. They asked about fear, about loneliness, about carrying responsibility that felt heavier than their own bodies. She didn't give long speeches. She gave short truths. Fear's not the enemy, rushing is. Loneliness doesn't break you, arrogance does. Precision is patience, that's all. And those words stuck. By the end of her first year as an instructor, the skepticism had dulled. The sideways glances faded. She wasn't just tolerated, she was trusted. Not because of her record, not even because of the silver star, but because she had given them something no one else could, the courage to wait. And still at night, alone in her quarters, she whispered to the ghosts, "I'm still here, I'm still steady, I'm still firing." Why does the end of one story never feel like an ending at all? Years later, the valley still lived inside her. Not in photographs, not in medals, not even in the silver star citation framed on a wall she rarely looked at. It lived in her breath, in the way wind touched her skin, in the silence that followed her into every new place. She carried it the way she carried the Barrett, not as a burden, not as a trophy, but as a covenant. At Fort Bragg, the students came and went, some young, some already scarred by experience. They arrived restless, some arrogant, some terrified. They left changed, carrying lessons stitched into them like scars they didn't see yet. Katia watched them graduate, watched them vanish into wars she would never step into again. Some came back to thank her. Some didn't come back at all. Both outcomes reminded her why she taught. Her name began to circulate beyond the range. Not as the first, not as the only, but as the one who never asked for excuses. Her lessons filtered into reports, into whispers in barracks, into the quiet discipline of men and women who steadied their breath before pulling a trigger. She didn't seek recognition. She sought continuity. A thread carried from her grandfather's hands in the snow, through her own in the dust, now into theirs. But recognition still found her. The silver star was pinned to her chest in a ceremony back on American soil. Cameras flashed, speeches were given. Words like valor and courage filled the air. She stood still, posture straight, eyes forward. Inside, she thought only of the valley, of 6 plates ringing like church bells, of Brennan, his hand wrapped, his pride bent into humility, of Martinez, whose absence had shaped every shot she ever took afterward. Her grandfather's absence ached that day. She wished he could have seen it, the way strangers stood when her name was called. But in a way, she believed he had. She carried his lessons in her every breath, every pause, every squeeze of the trigger. He was there, just not in the way the world measured presence. Brennan kept his word. He returned to Norfolk changed. In meetings and briefings, he argued for merit over myth. He stripped bias from assessments where he could, pushed for skill to outweigh stereotype. Some resisted. He kept pushing. Katia never saw him again, but she didn't need to. Their collision had already altered the course. Sometimes a rifle speaks louder than years of speeches. In quieter moments, she wondered about the men in that valley compound, the ones captured, not killed. She wondered if the intelligence they provided had spared families. She wondered if they thought about the night their guards disappeared one by one, unaware of the woman on the ridge who had threaded her breath into silence. She would never know. That was the nature of war. You touched lives you'd never meet, and you carried ghosts of men who never knew your name. Teaching dulled the sharpness of combat but replaced it with another weight. Responsibility stretched longer than any deployment. It wasn't one mission now. It was dozens, hundreds, carried on the backs of students who left her class and never looked back. Every time she saw one return, older, more weathered, she felt the circle close. Every time she heard of one who didn't return, the circle broke open again. Some nights when the barracks were quiet, she would walk out to the range alone. She would set a plate at 1,800 meters, settle behind the Barrett and let the silence of the night hold her. She would fire once, just once, and let the sound roll through the dark, not to prove anything, not to train, just to remind herself that precision was still hers, that silence still answered when she called it. She learned something in those years that combat hadn't taught her. That leadership wasn't about the loudest voice in the room. It wasn't about rank or medals or speeches. It was about steadiness, about standing still when others shook, about letting silence carry truth. And in the end, she understood something else too. That dignity doesn't argue. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It waits. It steadies. It fires. One evening, years after that dusty valley, she returned home to Montana. The field stretched wide, the horizon endless, the sky bigger than memory. She walked the land where her grandfather had once taught her to read mirage and wind, where prairie dogs had fallen under the steady beat of a girl's learning hands. She carried the Barrett with her, not as a soldier now, but as a woman who had seen the arc of silence bend into legacy. She set it down in the tall grass, leaned against the earth and let the wind move around her. She closed her eyes and breathed. In the rustle of the grass, she thought she heard Martinez's laugh. In the whistle of the breeze, her grandfather's voice. In the silence that followed, her own steady answer. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. She only needed to know she had been true to the thread she carried. That lives had been spared because she had steadied her breath, trusted the wind, and pulled the trigger when the world needed her to. And as the sun dipped, painting the sky with colors too wide for words, she whispered one last truth into the fading light. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.